Joining us this afternoon we have Kevin Doogan, author of New Capitalism, Transformation of Work, copy of which is up here, and Lucia Pradella, who's a researcher from Venice and author of a book on the current relevance of Marxist capital. They'll both be speaking for about 15 to 20 minutes, then we'll open it up to the floor, and we're beginning this afternoon with Kevin. Thank you.
It's called Precarity, the topic, and it's interesting that we talk about it as if we all know what it means. That's a term's been around for, I mean, people say we've had precariousness for forever, but the term precarity is actually relatively new. Jean-Claude Barbier did a survey of how it was used in the history of the term, and it appears that when he said in 2004 in Britain nobody had heard of the term, never used the term. In the previous major recession in the 1980s, nobody talked about precariousness. Nobody even talked about job insecurity. They talked about large-scale closures and so forth. So it's interesting that we now can talk with a familiarity as if we all understand what it means. And it is used to explain just about everything, and particularly a sense of precariousness that's rooted in irregular and atypical and non-standard employment. We explain, or many accounts of precariousness are explained in terms of a casualisation and impermanence in the world of work, which is said to have expanded over the last number of years. And because of this structural explanation of changes in the nature of industry, changes in the nature of occupations and so forth, it's wheeled onto the stage to explain many, many things. A quote here from somebody who'd written about Grangemouth and the defeat at Grangemouth, and how he explained the defeat. He said, "The effect of a recession means workers are fearful about losing their jobs. They're sceptical about industrial action, and the continual neoliberal assault on working conditions and the very makeup of the working class has its effects. If a significant proportion of your fellow workers are precarious, part-time, on 0 hours, or rolling contracts, contractors or agency workers, or even worse, unpaid interns or those on job experience, then that, the sheer presence of them, acts to undermine collective confidence and adds to the fears that your position is under threat." And it's an interesting account, an explanation for what went wrong in Grangemouth. And it's now like part of the radical common sense, widely accepted across whole swathes of the left. I should say, by the way, that quote is from Chris Bambury, late of this parish, in his accounts of what happened with Grangemouth. So it's interesting that it's become very, these ideas and the thinking and the structural explanations for defeat are becoming, quite important. And especially in a period where we've seen resistance to austerity relatively weak. We see, now we have talk about, after a very long period, we have talk about recovery. Cameron and Osborne crowing about the opportunities that are there for the economy and so forth. So you can see the appeal to these sorts of explanations. We can, in referring back to nostalgically to the smokestack imagery of days when there were real workers who beat bits of metal with hammers, and were based in manufacturing. We now have a kind of post-industrial world. So these are explanations of a structural accounts of what's gone wrong to explain the lack of resistance. And it's when you think about it, a weird kind of explanation, as if people on temporary work, casual work, agency staff and so forth, somehow, just by their sheer presence, manage to undermine the collective capacity of the majority of the workforce to resist, as if they're some kind of zombies that can suck the life out of the rest of the labour movement by their sheer presence. But as I say, what these accounts about precariousness and precarity, which have emerged recently and have become part of this consensus on the left, part of the explanations used by trade unions, social movements and so forth, have to be seen in terms of broader, longer narrative, a longer set of explanations of what's happening in the world of work. And we do have, briefly, to go back, for a particular reason, to go back to Daniel Bell and his account of post-industrial society. And it was a reasonably useful explanation about changes in the nature of industry, the distribution of employment across manufacturing services, shifts in occupational structure and so forth. Well researched and, you know, fair enough, a good piece of research. But he was very, very keen not to make too broad a generalization about broader changes in the nature of capitalism. He counselled against talking about the knowledge economy and so forth. But yet, since that time, if you look at Andre Gortz, if you look at Zygmunt Bauman, Manuel Castells, Richard Sennett and so forth, there's a different way in which the world of work is being portrayed. What we see is that this growing sense of impermanence and temporariness, the end of jobs for life and so forth, becomes part of a narrative which explains a fundamental shift in the relationship between capital and labour. So it is massively important to those accounts. And so what we see in the people I just mentioned, the impact and the influence of post-Marxism is hugely important. These, and this is an important argument, important aspect of the argument, these are accounts and arguments that come from the left. This is not coming from the right. That's also part of the argument which explains why it's become, you know, part of the radical common sense. There's another element to the influence of post-Marxism, and it's to do with dual labour market theory. The idea of dual labour markets, of primary labour markets and secondary labour markets, was a mainstream concept from people like, you know, Harris and Todaro, for all you economists out there. But they it fell into favour amongst mainstream economics. But it was brought back into fashion by left-wing economists. If we look at the influence of Bennett Harrison, Tom Weisskopf, and a number of people on associated with the Union of Radical Political Economists in the 1980s in America. These were the ones, and Michael Puri later on, these were the ones who established and argued for a difference in the labour markets of those who are primary workers and those who are secondary workers. So there were very important arguments in the 80s in America about this. Arguments between the left-wing economists and the mainstream economists. Very, very good, you know, significant empirical and statistical debates about it. So, but it's the influence of post-Marxism that explains this. Why, a few years later, in this country, it was Marxism Today, in 1986, that introduced to Britain the idea of the dual labour force. So we see the impact of post-Marxism, both in terms of changing the way understanding of work, of class, and of understanding the nature of labour markets, which divide the world of work into a primary group employed in core companies, apparently enjoying good prospects, good employment prospects, good pay, stable employment and so forth, and those who are employed in the secondary labour market, who are employed in the periphery and so forth, people who are casually employed, part-time, temporary and so forth. Now, there's two major problems with this idea of primary and secondary, and it's to do with, well, two concepts. One is differentiation and aggregation, that you can establish a very discrete boundary between those in good jobs and those in bad jobs. And you can also, by aggregating in a particular way, you can get a very, very distorted picture of what life is like in the secondary labour markets. If you lump together temporary, casual, short-term, 0 hours contract and so forth, and you generalise on the basis of the worst experience, those who are in temporary agencies, to the rest of the so-called secondary labour market, you massively exaggerate how bad things are for those in the secondary labour market. And similarly with the primary labour market, if you generalize from the best paid, as Zizek did, or Guy Standing, who said rather ridiculously that a third of all employees in America enjoy significant parts of their income through shares of the profits of the companies. It's utter nonsense. But I mean, that's the claims that are made for those in the primary groups and those in the secondary groups. So the influence of post-Marxism is hugely important. And that's why people can get away with and present as self-evident trends towards casualisation, temporariness, precariousness, and so forth, rooted in these irregular forms of employment, these specific forms of contract. Now, I want to talk about how this has become significant in recent times, because I think there's been a lot of, what you like, confusion about the impact of the crisis on the labour market and how it's working and what it means, and if people see now with unemployment going down a little bit, people thinking that it's over, that they've won, they've gone through the worst of it, and so forth. I think we have to assess the crisis very, very differently from how we've looked at crisis in the past. There is, in my view, this is, I feel like, a three-level crisis. First of all, to say about it overall, it is not primarily expressed in terms of jobs. The worst crisis in terms of GDP loss, and you only have unemployment of 8%. In my mind, it means that jobs is not the only indicator of the nature of this crisis. It is expressed in a number of ways, which previous crises haven't. In wage suppression, in pension reform, in welfare reforms, in the raising of retirement age, and so forth. These are the large-scale changes in the labour market, which talk to the nature of the current crisis and its radical novelty, in my view. Because of that, I want to suggest something else. The radical novelty of this crisis means that grievances accumulate more slowly. It is not like the crisis of the 1980s, in which you had overnight closures of large-scale plants. But if you've got a situation in which public sector workers, for instance, are told no wage increase for next year, if inflation is 2%, you keep your job, the extent to which the impact of that is felt, it doesn't happen overnight, but it's more and more experienced in year 2, year 3, and year 4. So the protracted nature of this crisis, the duration of this crisis, is much, much more significant than the depth of unemployment. Crucially, it means something else in terms of the form of attack and the protracted nature of the crisis. There was major student demonstrations in 2010 about the raising of tuition fees and so forth. Absolutely great. But what's also interesting is that the people demonstrating were not affected, or weren't to be affected by the raising of tuition fees. The people who were going to experience that were the cohorts coming after them. It wasn't them immediately. In terms of the impact of other changes, the raising of retirement, these are things which affect down the line for many, many people. I'm talking to my son, and his retirement date's 2058. Talk to him about final salary schemes, and his eyes just glaze over. You know, we're talking about things which are impacts which are down the line. Now, I'm not saying there are no immediate impacts, but there's a sense in which this crisis, the reform agenda, fiscal consolidation, means a reform programme which I think is actually 20 years long in terms of its duration, its longevity. It's not to be registered fully and confined to unemployment. So, therefore, when we're talking about precariousness, we have to understand that we have a crisis that operates at 3 different levels. We have a crisis that impacts internationally and globally, and it's highly uneven in terms of its, impacts. I've been to Norway a few times recently, talked to Norwegian students and Norwegian academics about the crisis, and you're talking about life on another planet, when unemployment is 3% in Norway. It's like talking to people about tsunamis and things that happen, you know, in foreign parts of the world. The crisis in Italy, the crisis in Greece, the crisis in Ireland is also of a different sort, is manifest differently. The crisis in the UK is also, has its own characteristics. The second aspect to the crisis is that it has a national expression in terms of the major measures taken. So we're talking about raising retirement age, pension reform, child benefit, which happen over and across the board. The previous crisis, the crisis of Fordism, were massively concentrated in terms of production industries and geographically in terms of the west of Scotland, South Wales, the northeast of the country and so forth. Hugely concentrated. These are effects which are hugely generalised across the board. And that's another reason why to simply see insecurity, work intensification, or whatever, as being confined to the margins of the labour market is to massively miss out and misread what life is like for the majority of the workforce. And therefore, they have this idea of precarity and precariousness and casualisation. Now, we have to say, and partly I spent a lot of time demonstrating this, that despite all the talk about intensification, despite all the talk about jobs for life, we have a situation in which employers not only need labour, they prioritise the retention of labour. Job tenures are increasing across the board internationally. Long service employment is increasing. One of the points that Phil made towards the very, very end of his talk, I thought, which is interesting, and it's pity he didn't have time to expand on it. For all the immediacy of work intensification, he articulated this so well. There's also beyond the immediacy of the strategies that the employers are not looking to bring about a hire and fire workforce culture. They're not looking to make temporary, to casualise. They're not looking to bring in more and more short-term employees. It's not as if long-term employment has increased by accident. It's not as if every Friday evening the worker in the factory is locked up and the employer forgets to sack the workforce. The fact that internationally trends towards long service employment are increasing is an important part of the debate. And beyond the immediacy of the insecurities generated by intensification programs, we need to remember that the priority and the efforts and the investments that employers put to retain labour is hugely important. I remember once talking to one of the senior managers of one of these big grocery retailers, Sainsbury's, and this is about 15 years ago now, when they were a fraction of what they are just now in terms of their size. And he said, last year we had 43,000 people leave Sainsbury's. We can't have that. In other words, they don't want high turnover. They don't want to casualise. There are examples of casualisation. There are good ideas of hourly paid people and so forth. But if you generalise across the board, you're making very, very big mistakes. Now, one of the problems, I think, this is happening with these notions, if I could invite a discussion about this. The UCU campaign around 0 hours contracts, I think, is mistaken. It's mistaken because there's very, very few people actually solely reliant upon 0 hours contracts in that sector. But what's happening is a lumping together of everybody who aren't on permanent full-time posts, and they're being wrapped up as 0 hours workers. So we get this, because the UCU said that there's 2,500 people in Edinburgh on 0 hours contracts. They ain't. They said that in Wolverhampton, the majority of the academic staff in Wolverhampton University are on 0 hours contracts. They're not. I was at a UCU meeting last week about casualisation, bringing in all these people from Bath, from West of England, and from Bristol universities, and only one person was on the 0 hours contract. Hugely pulling together a large number of categories, when really in the sector, in my view, the problem is not 0 hours, but it's hourly paid workers who are paid on a different basis from people who are in established posts. That is, I think, the issue. But if you say the majority of the workforce are based upon 0 hours contracts and these spurious legal kind of contracts, then I think you're at risk of grossly overstating, distorting the situation. Finally, in terms of the relevance and appropriateness of precarity, to explain what's going on, there are 6% of the workforce in Britain that are on temporary contracts, temporary employees. And it hasn't changed that much during the crisis. There's insufficient numbers to generate the massive experience, captured in opinion poll evidence across the board in terms of insecurity. You cannot explain it or confine it to those on irregular contracts. When Guy Standing says the precariat is a different class of worker with a distinct set of interests and a distinct set of insecurities, we see probably the worst example of this dual labour market thinking that I've seen for many, many years. And the influences, acknowledged to me, the influence of people like Michael Puri in all of that. If, however, we understand the balance of class forces and resistance, politically and ideologically, that austerity is a remedy, a fiscal consolidation is a form strategy that enjoys hegemony across the mainstream, across the political parties, from Conservative, Liberal and Labour. Therefore, the campaign, the fight against austerity, against fiscal consolidation, must rely upon more than simply anger and a sense of injustice, but it must rely upon a sense and a vision of alternatives to austerity. This can only come from the far left. Thanks.
Okay, hi. My paper is focused on the ongoing process of impoverishment in Western European countries. In fact, in Western Europe, the crisis is leading to a dramatic increase in the number of unemployed, precarious workers and the working poor. The trend is most alarming in hard-hit countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal and Italy, but is rising also in the UK and Germany. Unemployment levels within the European Union have reached unprecedented inter-country differences, and they range from 5.4% in Germany to 13% in Italy and 17% in Spain and Greece. In the last 3 years, yes, I have 2 slides, if I can find a way to show them. Yeah, here. Yeah. Yes. Yes, these are 2 slides about trends in real wages in the EU 27 before the crisis between 2001 and 2009, where we see that almost just in Germany there was a decrease in real wages, and then after the outbreak of the crisis, when real wages only nominally increased in Germany and declined by more than 3% in Italy and the UK, by almost 7% in Portugal and Spain, and by 23% in Greece. In 2012, according to Eurostat, almost 1/4 of the EU 15 population, nearly 92 million people, including people in work, was at risk of poverty or social exclusion. So this was 85 million people more than 5 years ago, so no, 6 years ago in 2007. And in the UK, significantly, today in-work poverty, so the people who work but are poor, so in-work poverty is today the dominant characteristic of poverty. So there are more people in work than people who are poor and don't work. These processes, in my opinion, are not a temporary crisis-induced phenomenon. They are not just a crisis-induced phenomenon, but they reflect longer structural trends towards impoverishment that are linked to the dynamics of the rate of profit and to the rise of new industrial centers of accumulation, China in particular. In order to prove this thesis, I shall first examine what Marx told us about impoverishment in capital, and then I'll try to explain how his analysis helps us to understand roots and effects of neoliberalism and the crisis in Western Europe. If I have enough time, I'll try to draw some political conclusions from this analysis. Okay, first of all, for Marx, impoverishment is a structural characteristic of capital accumulation. It is the precondition for the formation of the proletariat, which presupposes a process of dispossession of independent producers, and it is a necessary result of the production of wealth as capital. Accumulation, in fact, tends toward an increasing polarization between relative wealth and poverty, which shouldn't be confused with the extreme impoverishment of the working class considered as an undifferentiated whole. This tendency depends on the fact that increasing productivity in capitalism does not aim at improving living standards, but at increasing labor exploitation. And the goal of labor productivity, therefore, is to decrease the relative wage, which expresses the difference between the value produced and the value appropriated by workers. Under certain conditions, such as, for example, the economic boom after the Second World War in Western Europe, declining relative wages could coexist with increasing real wages and consumption levels of some sections of the working class. Impoverishment, however, cannot be reduced to consumption level for Marx. And in Capital, he examines also the negative effects of wage labor on the kind of labor process, and so the negative effects of the division of labor on the workers' personality and well-being. And these kind of negative effects are not confined to the factories or to workplaces, but they involve the reproduction process more in general. The situation of the working class, moreover, has to be analyzed in the capitalist system as a whole. And in Capital, from my point of view, Marx examined the structural role of imperialism in the accumulation process. And he affirmed that since living labor is the only source of value, the difficulties provoked by the declining role of living labor in production, which result from mechanization, and translate into a declining rate of profit, so these difficulties compel capital to increase labor exploitation to the utmost. And one of the main means of achieving this objective is the internationalization of production and the expansion of the global industrial reserve army of unemployed and underemployed, who are exploitable through international investments and migration. The pressure from this socially constructed overpopulation plays a fundamental disciplining role in production and allows an increasing exploitation both in relative and absolute terms. Marx also affirmed that class struggle and anti-colonial resistance can shape state policies, and so limiting the relative worsening of the worker situation, but they cannot halt this worsening except by overthrowing the system itself. And this system develops by means of a vicious circle in which workers make themselves relatively redundant as members of their class. In fact, the expansion of the global reserve industrial army creates the condition for the compression of wages and puts pressure on the employed workers, thus limiting their claims. And these workers are forced by the low level of wages to prolong the working day, reducing the demand for labor power and permitting a greater labor supply on the market. So for Marx, overwork and underemployment and unemployment feed off one another. So this is a structural mechanism which, from my point of view, needs to be considered both at the global and at the national level by looking at the interaction between these two levels. And the kind of main thesis of Marxist Capital is that accumulation causes the impoverishment of the working class as a whole at the international level, despite and through the differentiation of the condition of the national sectors of the working class. I think that since the outbreak of the crisis of profitability in the 70s and the rise of neoliberalism, the mechanisms that Marx analyzed in Capital have been at work even more clearly than in the post-war period. And in order to understand how these mechanisms worked, I think we need to look at neoliberalism as a global system of accumulation. And neoliberal policies enhanced the process of impoverishment and dispossession in the global south and the former Soviet bloc, expanding the global reserve army of Western capital. These developments, in fact, added almost 1.5 billion workers to the pool of labor power seeking work under competitive conditions. The global restructuring of production, at the same time, undermined the division of labor between industrialized centers in imperialist countries and the producers of raw materials in the global south, a division of labor that had emerged in the colonial period. And according to according to the International Labour Organization, since the mid-70s, the industrial labor force in the global south has outgrown that in the north, up to the point that almost 80% of the global industrial workforce today now lives in the global south. And always, if we look at the International Labour Organization data, today there are nearly 2.4 billion people who belong to the global industrial reserve army, and an estimated 940 million working poor who live below the $2 a day poverty line. I think that only if we look at these kind of major trends globally can we understand the effects of the crisis in Western Europe and the US. And in the EU, in EU 15, the neoliberal period has been characterized by increasing capital flows to and immigration from third countries. In this process, northern member states have progressively shed capacity and jobs in the low-quality end of production range, specializing in capital-intensive production and services, while low capital-intensive production has concentrated in southern member states. These transformations resulted also in a substantial increase in unemployment, which initially, but only initially, was compensated by the development of non-standard forms of employment and the expansion of the so-called service sectors. At the same time, restrictive and selective migration policies have produced illegality and a differential system of rights. Neoliberal immigration policies, in fact, do not aim at stopping immigration, but at rendering immigrant workers hyper-precarious and blackmailed workers who are forced to make every sacrifice in order to stay in a country and are forced to be, if possible, temporary immigrants. The condition of extreme precarity is particularly evident for those immigrant workers who are effectively blackmailed because of their so-called illegal status. Restrictive immigration legislation, therefore, does not produce precarity and illegal employment only for immigrant workers, but by fostering the stratification of the labor market, it aims at expanding this condition through the whole working class, or create a condition of insecurity which affects all workers, and also through racism and kind of a hierarchical labor condition, also seeks to impede a kind of process of unification of struggles. Restrictive and selective migration policies, therefore, have been an integral part of the policies, neoliberal policies that have precarized working relations in the neoliberal period. Trade union strategies have been largely ineffective in front of these transformations and against reforms reducing the scope for trade union activity and promoting labor market flexibility, workfare and privatization. And these processes have weakened unions and led to increasing low pay, wage inequalities and poverties. And at the same time, the increase in low-paid work, jobs and poverty has not affected only the people most directly affected by them, but has generated a general downward pressure on wages and working conditions that has affected the whole working class. These processes have been observed first in the UK, which has witnessed a huge process of the industrialization and the shift towards services-based sectors. At the same time, in Britain, the labour supply substantially increased, mainly because of net immigration and of workfare policies. In Germany, income and wage inequality and poverty, including in-work poverty, have grown considerably only after 1991, so after the country's reunification. And although Germany has retained a higher share of industrial employment than most other Western European countries, since the end of the 90s, the process of outsourcing, offshoring, has been very significant in Germany and has played a major role in the export growth of the German economy. In the mid-2000s, Germany had one of the highest shares of immigrant workers in total employment in Western Europe, around 14%. And in 2003-2005, the Hartz-IV reforms introduced a new paradigm of workfare policies, forcing unemployed workers to accept jobs for less than €3 an hour and creating millions of mini-jobs. By 2009, the UK had one of the highest incidences of low wages in the EU15, around 20.6%, followed closely by Germany, which was around 20.2%. In Italy, we witnessed similar trends, but in 2009, the official percentage of low-paid workers was much lower than in the UK or Germany. And this was, but despite this, we had around 99% of low-paid workers, but because of the weakness of the welfare state, in-work poverty rates and poverty rates in Italy were much higher. Confirming Marx's analysis of the relationship between low wages, poverty and exploitation, in the neoliberal period, a growing proportion of workers have been forced into either particularly short or increasingly long hours. In the UK, since Thatcherism, working hours have been particularly long and unequally distributed. In Germany, the systematic recourse to overtime in the industry made the 35-hour week ineffective long before the working week was officially reset at 40 hours in the mid-2000s. The spread of Toyotaism, as Philip Taylor has argued in the plenary, has led to an identification of work in all branches of a social organization, generating a work environment which is much more stressful, insecure and harmful than the Fordist one. Workfare and victimization of the unemployed, moreover, have contributed to the increasing brutalization of work experienced by workers in the neoliberal period. Okay, we see that these processes were ongoing also before the crisis, and despite these processes, there hasn't been a kind of, the rate of profit of a Western capital hasn't recovered substantially. And these processes globally, especially in the global south, have generated increasing opposition and resistance. And they have also laid the conditions for the emergence of new centers of accumulation like China. And if we look at the global picture and somehow try to overcome the Eurocentric approach of interpretations of the EU crisis, we see that if we widen the range of countries considered as competitors, as for example Cambridge Econometrics has done, we see that the scale of deterioration of EU competitiveness in manufacturing is much higher than if Brazil, India and China in this slide, if we exclude these three countries, the deterioration of the competitiveness in European manufacturing is 40%, whereas if we include emerging countries, this deterioration is much higher. And from my point of view, this kind of framework helps us to understand why the crisis is affecting so profoundly EU industry, where nearly 4 million industrial jobs have been lost since the outbreak of the crisis, and why it is affecting the EU so unevenly. And so we can somehow explain the kind of diversification in trends in real wages that we somehow briefly saw at the beginning. We can also explain why we see, especially in countries with macroeconomic imbalances, the EU has developed a new paradigm of wage policy interventionism, which is leading to an erosion of collective bargaining systems and to a convergence towards the much more strongly enterprise-oriented negotiating structures that were previously completed in other European states. But also in countries that performed best in preserving employment, like Germany and the UK, employment is shifting into the precarious labor market. This is quite proved with regard to Germany, and as far as I know, in the UK, the unemployment rates have remained low compared with the previous crisis, but this was the result of growing underemployment, self-employment, and temporary and part-time employment. Of course, then we can discuss the sources. So this was basically based on, oh my God, where is it? The Office for National Statistics. Okay. Also, yes. These overall processes of impoverishment are also triggering more intense pressures towards market and workplace discipline. And the main goal of them is to restore international competitiveness and profitability, which is, however, still well below the peak of 2007. And that's why I think investment is not recovering in the EU and is shifting towards the global south, up to the point that UNCTAD in 2012 affirmed that for the first time, developing economies absorbed close to half of global FDI flows. Okay, I want to draw 4 main conclusions very, very briefly from this analysis. First, the crisis is proving with even more evidence than before that precarity and poverty have a structural place in capital accumulation and play a central role in increasing labor exploitation. Conditions of poverty and precarity do not only concern those most affected by them, but represent an attack on the whole working class. That's why we need to find a collective working class response able to unify workers with different employment and legal statuses and income levels. Thirdly, in Western Europe, the fight against imperialism and support for the struggles and resistance against our own imperialism are not a kind of humanitarian question, but are a necessary condition for the defense of workers' living and working conditions here. An anti-imperialist perspective, finally, is also a necessary condition for giving a real solidarity to workers, immigrant workers, fighting increasing racism and Islamophobia. The fight against institutional racism and the support for immigrant worker struggles are a condition for the emancipation of the entire working class and a unitary fight against the crisis.
My name is Martin Thomas from Workers' Liberty. I want to ask 2 just factual questions and then make a point. factual questions are the figures for people on non-standard contracts. Are those affected if we try to make an estimate of the black and grey economy? If you're dealing with official figures here, you may be significantly out, particularly in a period of crisis. And the second thing is, factual thing is, will you comment on the shift between now and, say, the 1930s in relation to age structures of employment? In the sense that in the 1930s, youth unemployment was lower than unemployment among older workers. Now it has shifted to the inverse. The analytical point I wanted to make is this. I think it's absolutely right to say that it's misleading to divide the working class into two bits, one of which is secure, the other is insecure, as if there were a war between them. But to make that point may blind us to what is going on in the way of an increasing differentiation in the working class, which is not a differentiation which is fixed, which is not necessarily a differentiation which is between clearly defined sectors, but which is nevertheless very significant. I conclude on an example. The ports in Australia. If you go back many decades, you have an entire workforce which is casual. You then have a period where there's an entire workforce which has fairly stable, uniform working conditions where the union controls hiring. You now have a situation where you have a workforce where it varies from port to port, but in most ports there are 3 or 4 different grades of workers. Permanent, a bit more casual, a bit more casual, a bit more casual. All of them are fairly long-term workers, and they're doing the same work, but they are all on different contracts.
Thanks, Con.
Yeah, I want to talk about this idea of precariousness as a noun or as an adjective. I would certainly agree with those comrades who are saying, well, actually, who reject the dual labour market theory. I don't believe it explains the current situation, but I would argue that precariousness is a psychological condition that many workers feel. Phil Taylor was giving a discussion this morning about all the new managerial techniques which have been introduced in the last 20 years, performance management and all these things. And I think they do have the effect of making workers feel precarious. That means insecure in their workplace. And I think the psychological impact of precariousness is real, whether or not we think that there is actually a dual class. I, for my sins, last year was invited to a talk in Milan in Italy by a group called Saint Precarious. So they have this thing called Saint Precarious Day. They've in Italy even devoted a saint to precarity. And I think there the discourse is different from here in Britain, because there is much higher levels of youth unemployment there. And there is an issue of, people working on short-term contracts. Although here we also have to be careful. I work in the IT industry. In the IT industry, 20 years ago, there was a massive move towards contracting in my industry. This has been reversed in the last 10 years. In fact, the companies are trying to get rid of contractors, and they are actually, putting a gun to the head of many people who are contract workers. Either you accept a permanent position or we'll sack you. So this is a weird situation. It's never discussed in these terms, precarity. Actually, management like to have permanent staff, and they don't like to have contract workers because, they get paid a bit, but then they disappear off and go travelling in India for 6 months, and they come back again. And they don't like that. And actually, they like to have permanent staff, which they've discovered they can control more effectively than contract workers. And this is, I think, the whole discourse about precarity misses this out. Also, another point about low wages. One of the interesting things I noticed in London, poverty wages is not something which is connected with precarity at all. Most people on poverty wages have got full-term contracts. Most people receiving housing benefit in London are not unemployed, but are people on full-time permanent contracts. People like in low-wage, catering or other industries where they have permanent contracts. So I think these are some points we can add to the debate on precarity.
Hi, Pete Jackson from Birmingham. I work in the DWP in a job centre. And I wanted to pick up really what Kevin was saying, employers want stability, and the last speaker was saying employers want stability. And as long as you understand that, you can put some things into context. If you buy into the precarity theory, then you see it everywhere. And I wanted to just use an example of that really, because boycott workfare, people who campaign against workfare, I have a lot of time for. They do some fantastic work, but they buy into the idea that we're all going to be turned into slaves and we're not going to get any wages at all. A really very recent article has highlighted there are now 4,000 work experience slaves in the job centres. And if you read that, you think, oh my God, they're now starting to introduce precarity into the environment in which I work. And obviously this is a government strategy. This is the point they're making. It's a government strategy really to de-skill and to de-wage right across the civil service. Now the government's trying to do all sorts of things in the civil service. This isn't really one of them. The truth is there are 4,000 people on work experience. Now whatever you think of people being sent into work experience, what it isn't is these people taking our jobs. In reality, in my office at least, we don't let work experience people do anything because they can't be allowed to work with the customers because they haven't had any training and you don't know what they might say, what they might do and whether they might get hurt if they make a mistake. So we don't let them do it. Which means that really all they get to do is whatever crazy little things the managers come up with and literally cut and paste, not the new style with your computer, cut and paste, scissors, glue, stick stuff on other stuff to put around the office. This is what the DWP calls work experience, but it's what boycott workfare called precarity being introduced into the civil service. And so it's a little example really, which is about the way that we interpret what's going on. So I think we have to be very, very careful to believe that this is creeping up on us everywhere. We do have to do something about it. If we didn't, as a PCS union rep, if I didn't say, well actually I'm not going to let that work experience person sit over there, do the floor walking, talk to those people, well then maybe, just maybe, down the road, they start to introduce this. So the two things come together. The point I guess I'm trying to pull out really is that if you accept the ideology of precarity, you start to see it everywhere and it starts to impact on the way you organise. If you oppose the ideology of precarity, you can start to see differently what can be done. If you oppose it ideologically, you can oppose it practically far more easily. Once you accept that it's there and it's creeping and there's nothing you can do about it, it's actually very hard to resist on the ground.
See, first we have to ask why are we having this discussion. And with the greatest of respect to Kevin, I don't think it's because of the influence of post-Marxism. I think it's because we're now, whatever it is, 6 years into the crisis and there hasn't been a commensurate working class response. And I think it's because of what Phil Taylor brought out so well in the first session. Why was there such a powerful response to what he said? Because of people's practical experience of the intensification of labour at work. And we have to respond to, and it's these pressures from life itself that are leading to the discussion. Now, I think there are two mistaken ways to respond. The first is to say everything has changed, the precariat, or the multitude, or something like that, and all the contours of class exploitation characteristic of society, of capitalist society, have just kind of disappeared into something new. That's a mistake. But I think it's also a mistake to say that nothing has changed. So I think it's very useful to be reminded of just what a small percentage of the British workforce is on temporary contracts, although I think John Sinner's right, that's not necessarily true in other countries. And more generally, Kevin's book is very useful in documenting the continuities in employment and work structure and the organisational structure of capitalism and so on and so forth. But as Jane put it at the end of the plenary, the intensification of work that is experienced by workers with permanent contracts makes workers generally feel insecure, and this is what we have to think very seriously about. You see, I think it's a mistake to say, as Martin Thomas does, that this leads to greater differentiation. I don't think that's true at all. If you look, for example, at higher education, what we're seeing is a process of proletarianization. Performance management is now something that leads to greater and greater... Does that mean I've got a minute, or that I shut up? Yeah, okay, important distinction. the pressures of managerialism in what used to regard themselves as professions, like university teaching, school teaching and so on, represents in many ways a homogenization of workers' experiences across different industries and across public and private sector. Now, in this context, I think I agree completely with Lucia. I mean, I don't agree with everything that she said, but I think that Marx's theory of the Industrial Reserve Army is tremendously valuable, because what he does is to distinguish between a whole set of different categories that shade into permanent wage labour, where what we now call the more or precarious categories, and I don't think we should simply ban the word because it corresponds to something real, where the existence of those in the more precarious categories, combined with the managerial pressures that I was referring to, make all workers feel insecure. And we have to try and analyse this properly, above all in order to come up with an adequate political response.
Thanks. I want to thank both speakers, really, because I think this idea that there are more poor people in work than there are poor people out of work, that's something that we should really be, telling as many people as possible about, because we're constantly told that the reason people are poor is because they don't want to work, or they come from a culture of worklessness, and all the rest of it, that we're told that most of the people on the so-called benefit street are out of work, and it's just not true. But what I want to ask, really, I just want to ask about the idea of an hourglass economy, because I've heard it in a couple of places. I know Owen Jones talks about it, the idea that there's jobs at the top and at the bottom but not in the middle, and it seemed to kind of make sense to me when I was applying for jobs. Like, you'd see a lot of jobs advertised, like director level, 50 grand, and you see a lot of jobs, handing out flyers or putting flyers through people's door. You work 4 hours a day, you get paid less than minimum wage for those 4 hours. Not a lot of the sort of the jobs you might expect to do if you've just graduated from a degree, maybe at local government, or working in the NHS, the back office admin, sort of 20 grand jobs. I just want to know how that all fits into it, if that's a useful concept, or if it's just pointlessly differentiating between workers, then tell me.
Hi, I'm Tom from Sheffield, and I'm a part-time worker at Asda, one of the people that would probably be described as working in a precarious workplace, in a workplace of 350 people. I think outside of the management and supervisors, there must be about 20 people on full-time contracts. The rest are part-time, and I think for me one theme which seems to dominate discussions of precarity is the idea that there is nothing that we can do about it, and this is somehow an endless march to the rug being pulled from under our feet in terms of working class organisation. And I just wanted to kind of give an example about how I've been able to organise in a workplace with a high level of part-time staff. Because I think one thing that we have to be clear about is, yes, it is extremely useful to have an understanding of the nature of the way that work changes in terms of recruiting people to the union. But one thing we have to be absolutely strident about is that the best way to recruit people to a trade union is not on the basis of the way that work changes. For instance, I can tell you at Asda that we meant to scan 19.5 things per minute. Every week it is on the notice board is a ranking of all of the staff and how quickly they scan things. Have I recruited anyone to the union on the basis of that? No. But if you talk about wider political ideas in the workplace, for instance, selling socialist worker, bringing up the 22nd of March, etc., then you can raise a political level within which the question of should you join a union becomes key. An example from that is, for a very long time I've been trying to get people to join a union with no real success. But then we had a day at work where we ran out of carrier bags. That's right, the supermarket ran out of carrier bags because the general manager had cancelled an order of 1,000 because of budgetary requirements. Now, because I had been arguing with people about wider politics and the fact that they should join the union for months and well, for really a year beforehand, 10 people joined the union on that day. I think we have to be clear that the way to unionise and the way to move away from the precarious nature of work is through arguing wider politics with people, because actually being determines consciousness. The events that happen in people's lives will shift them politically, and we have to be there arguing wider politics so that when those events happen, we can shape things. So thank you very much.
I don't believe that the precariat is a class, but I also do believe that there are shifting divisions of labour, whether they're based on gender, race, ethnicity, skill, whatever. And I do think it's really important that we reflect the lived experience of workers. And something that hasn't been mentioned today is privatisation. I don't think we can underestimate the impact that privatisation is having on workers' lives. And we know privatisation is designed to remove workers from collective organisation. So it fragments workers and it's much harder to organise them. And that doesn't mean to say we can't organise them, but it is a structural barrier. And I want to just talk about one example of privatisation which is going on now, which is the privatisation of home care, with councils letting out home care contracts to private providers in the context of reduced budgets, where the contracts are squeezed so much that the providers are not guaranteed any packages of work or guaranteed hours, which means they then cannot guarantee hours to the home care workers, which means they employ them on 0 hours. And I think 0 hours is an issue that we have to reflect. There has been an increase in national figures on 0 hours working, but we know that it's absolutely massively under-recorded because people don't realise they're on 0 hours workers. You talk to any young person who works in a shop, they're on 0 hours contracts. They don't know that's what they're called, but they are, and it's become a way of life for young workers. But home care workers now on 0 hours contracts, the majority of them on 0 hours contracts. Women who used to go and work for a council, had a workplace, had social relations at work, now never see another worker because they get their roster on their phone, on their mobile phone, completely isolated and of course very, very difficult to organise. And we know that this increased employment which we've seen is actually based on low paid, but also low hours work. And that's why they can say there's an increase in employment. And it's based on this reconfiguration of working hours, which 0 hours encourages. And we know the Tories now love the national minimum wage because they know they can accommodate a national living wage, and they can accommodate an hourly living wage through the reconfiguration of working hours and reducing people's working hours. So I'm not quite sure why today we're so hung up about this debate on precarisation and whether there's a precariat, because I think Lucia is right, it's about organising workers across fragmented work and workplaces.
It's Marianne Owens. I'm on the National Executive Committee of PCS, and I'm in the SWP in Cardiff. And I have to say, I thought it was quite interesting, the talk, because for me, the term precariat, I think, just kind of sprung about 2 years ago into every discourse and trade union meeting, every conversation we had, just out of nowhere. I think, like Kevin was saying, it was taken as being, this is the logical thing that the people are talking about. But, I thought, okay, I probably haven't been listening properly, I should know what this means. And then it took me a while to work out exactly what it did mean. And what it seems to mean to me is that certainly within the trade union movement, it's become an excuse for inaction. It's become an excuse to say, oh, well, we've got all these temporary workers, they're never going to come out on strike, they're never going to actually join the union, you can't organise them, so, that's going to completely undermine any action that we take. But in practice, that's not the case. We've got, I work in a big workplace, I think I said before, in the tax office in Cardiff. We have 2,300 union members. 300 of those are on fixed-term contracts, and those 300 people, that is 96% of the people on fixed-term contracts that we've got, who are actually in the union and actually participate in stuff. And I think it's a misnomer that you can't organise them. I think that the argument really here creates a division between different parts of the workforce and different parts of whatever, you know. I mean, we're safe, we've got full-time contracts, you know, we're safe forever. It's those people will be got rid of first, you know. That's not the case. We talked about all the performance management stuff and the bell curves and all the rest of it this morning. Actually, we're all at risk all of the time of being kicked out for our employers, so think so. And I think the poverty issue is a real one as well. I mean, working in the tax office, you'd think that we got paid enough not to be receiving tax credits, but 40% of the staff that work in the tax office actually receive tax credits, which I think tells you a little bit about the level of pay that full-time permanent staff have got in there. But I think what we need to get away from is this idea of putting workers in different boxes. I think that workers are workers, and the way that we actually do something about it is we organise them, because what they actually put onto those people who are precarious is coming for us. If we're not currently seen as being precarious, somewhere down the line, everything that they're putting on workers on temporary contracts, somewhere down the line is going to be heaved upon everybody else. And that's what we need to fight. And a bit of a one from history. If they could organise the chain makers 100 years ago who worked in their back gardens, you know, completely isolated from everybody else, to have one of the biggest strikes that won one of the first, you know, national wages, and I think, you know, we can organise our call centre workers and people that work in coffee shops, don't you?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Pradella for introducing the discussion about poverty in the working class, because I think the idea that poverty isn't something that's marginal to working class experience, it's something that people who are in work experience, and it's something that is a growing thing that we're all struggling with, is extremely important, and the fact that more people in poverty are in work than otherwise. But I think the discussion both about poverty and about the changing nature of the working class and the question of so-called precarity or not has to be put in the context of what Marx said about the fundamental divisions that exist within capitalism. And he said there are two fundamental divisions, didn't he? The first one being competition. He describes the capitalist class as a band of warring brothers. And I think if you want to talk about inequality within the EU or global inequality, you have to understand that this is about a battle between different capitals and different nation states trying to get one up on other people. And that's, I think, at the basis of such inequality. But capitalism, competition also drives the second major divide that Marx talks about under capitalism, which is the great divide which keeps the economy driving forwards, which is the drive of exploitation, the antagonistic relationship between a capitalist class that are constantly trying to exploit us, to drive us more. We've talked already in great detail about the intensification that we feel of being exploited at work, the new management techniques that are used to try and work us harder for less money. This is part and parcel of that central drive that Marx was talking about, the question of exploitation. And I think if you understand class in those terms, then you can see that Marx's concept of class can accommodate really an infinite varieties of configurations of the working class. So class is not something that is static or to do with a particular form of employment contract or to do with a particular nature of working in manufacturing rather than service. It's to do with the way in which profits are exploited from all of us. And that will take different forms at different times. And the working class has been through very, very many changes over the years. But I do think that that's not a substitute for analysing the actual details of what is and isn't happening. And here I think the discussion is very interesting, because I think there is a tendency either to say that precarity is a new phenomenon and people are living in margins in new sorts of ways, or to say that there is no precarity and nobody is insecure. And in reality, both of those positions I think are wrong. I haven't really got time to go into that, although I do think there's quite a lot of confused thinking about this. For example, lumping in part-time workers with people on temporary contracts. You can be in secure employment and work part-time. It doesn't make you part of the precariat. So you've got to bear in some of the... We need a little bit more precision, I would say, around some of this. The final thing I wanted to say was, I think Pradella is quite right to raise the question of immigration and immigrant workers. I work in the NHS, and there is not a day that goes past that I do not have an argument with other people about migrants are taking the health service, you know, or they're taking our jobs, or all sorts of different questions. This is a live debate in the working class in Britain and elsewhere, and it is one that we have to take up as part and parcel of everything else we're fighting over. But we do also have to remember that migrants are not just marginal to the economy. I said I worked in the NHS, obviously it's hard if you're an illegal immigrant, but most migrants in Britain are here and are part of our workforce. And when we have struggles in the NHS, you see that migrant workers are not marginal. They're the people who are the nurses, the doctors, the porters, the cleaners. They're absolutely central, and we have a big history of immigrant and indigenous, if you like, we're all immigrants to be honest, but different waves of immigrant workers being absolutely part and parcel. And that's the key question, is we have the agency to change things as well as to be attacked by the ruling class.
I think it's important to say that, I mean, for me it's not necessarily a new thing. I mean, when I started my career in teaching 28 years ago, I started off as a part-timer, then a half-time on a fixed-term contract, then gradually I got a full-time job, and in the last 8 years of my career I was on fixed-term contracts for years again. So it's like, and there is issues with that. I was always in union workplaces, but on the other hand, in the last few years, it was like you do feel more insecure because you actually got several things to do. You've got to make sure you keep that contract and it's renewed after a year. So that means there are pressures on you to say, I didn't become a rep, I was still in the union, but there are certain pressures on you not to do some of the things you would have done in the security of actually having a full-time job. But because I'm a socialist, I try and push the boundaries, but that's not true of everybody. But I think what I wanted to say is in the last job that I had, it's the thing about the full-time workers in that job and people like me who are on fixed-term contracts all had the same feeling of insecurity. There's actually what people talked about this morning, about the pressures on work, the pressures that they are putting in terms of appraisals, all the rest of it, affected all of us. So in the end, in my last job, all the people who are on fixed-term contracts and all the people who are on full-time contracts all spent the last 2 years of our career in a particular workplace worried about being made redundant. All of us. And actually that meant we had an awful lot in common. The problem I think about it is, and actually the redundancies were as a result of Suffolk County Council making cuts in their education budget. So you're actually talking about a situation where those cuts in the public sector are impacting on people's employment. But I think what I'd like to say is, so we are all in the same box. The problem was not that we didn't feel the same, not that we wouldn't have stood together. The problem was the union did absolutely jack shit about it. That was the problem, not that we would have done it. If we had the confidence and the union had taken a lead in fighting those redundancies rather than saying, nothing much we can do, council haven't got the money, then there would have been a chance that all of those full-time and part-time and temporary workers would have actually, and the workplace, we talked about it together in the same terms, but we weren't able to fight it not because of our unease about the situation, but because the unions weren't doing anything. And I think there is, what people have said, there isn't a Chinese wall between the two. You can work together, you do need to work together, but the big problem for us is like the problem people have talked about in previous sessions is the lack of leadership from the unions, the lack of organisation. I mean, it took a long time for me to be able to recruit part-time workers into my union because it wasn't exactly accepted. Now it is more, but we've still got a huge job to do to make sure that the big question is, when are the unions going to fight? How do we make the unions fight? Not the fact that we're precarious or not precarious, or we're all in it together. We just have to make sure that actually when the fight back comes, well, I'm not putting this too well, am I really? The problem is the unions, not us as the workforce, because actually we will be united if there's leadership and if there's solidarity and we feel we can do it.
I think really, to follow on from that really, part of it is the state of our organisation that makes a lot of us feel really, really nervous about what's going on. I mean, I'm a teacher as well, and loads of teachers feel that they can be instantly sacked, but actually teachers cannot be instantly sacked for most cases, but the feeling that it could happen is very, very high. So you have this sense of insecurity, but it's no surprise that there's a sense of insecurity, partly because the ideological argument that they've had around the crisis and who's to blame for the crisis. So the bankers have seemed to have got away scot-free, but it was all the horrible nurses or teachers or firefighters. They were the people to blame for the crisis. So there's huge ideological onslaught that took place to try to shift the blame for it. But it also comes on the back of if you like, not enough class struggle. And certainly part of what we're going through in education is that for quite a long time we had quite nice deals really with the employers. The employers weren't on the offensive, the unions could sit down, things are okay. Suddenly when they want to try to take money from the system, they want to try to alleviate the sufferings of the bosses, if you like, suddenly when they start having a go at us, all those niceties that had taken place where, in effect, the level of unionisation wasn't the most important thing in the workplace. The fact that there wasn't an offensive was the most important thing. That then gets ripped apart when there is an offensive, and so people feel under a lot of pressure. Now, of course, the big thing that challenges that is class struggle. So although people might feel quite precarious, actually I think when we had the November the 30th strikes 3 years ago, a lot of people didn't feel as precarious, and on the 1st of December they didn't feel as precarious, and whether they struck or not, a lot of people felt less precarious. Then when the unions bottled the thing, more people felt precarious, and it just seems to me that part of it is looking at that level of class struggle in really, really simple terms. And people can talk about lots of different people, whether they're shop workers, whether they're in all types of industries, but the truth is that miners had to organise to stop feeling less precarious. They had to organise to get their own way. Teachers had to organise to get to a better position. Shop workers had to organise to get to a better position. And there's no simple magic bullet to this. People will have to organise, and the more struggles that take place, the easier it is to do it. And I think that part of then the debate on this is the use value. What can we do around this? Because if we just say being precarious is bad, woe is us, well, we're buggered really. There's not much we can do about it apart from feel afraid. And part of it might be saying, well, how can we encourage unionisation drives? If we're in places where there is a bit of struggle taking place, how can we take that elsewhere? How do we get the collections? How do we help leaflet factories? How do we help organise shopping centres? For example, the RMT, I'll finish on this, the RMT organise at stations. Most of the staff at stations nowadays don't work on railways, they work in the shops. There's a huge amount of people in the shops. We could all help organise people in there. The RMT recognise things. So through trades councils, Unite the Resistance groups, whatever, you can help organise to get simple successes. And I do think that when you have one or two simple successes, then it means people feel more confident to challenge, and in which case they end up feeling less precarious. And as we've discussed, precariousness at the minute is more a state of mind than an actual being, and that's one of the things we've got to challenge.
Quickly on 0 hours contract and home care workers is a really excellent piece of research by the Lope Commission, looking at how it's arisen as a consequence of privatisation. An excellent piece of research by the Lope Commission looking at 0 hours contracts in London affecting women, particularly black women, and as a consequence of the privatisation and outsourcing from local authorities, which I can recommend to you. I think it's a different case in FE and HE, as I mentioned. Secondly, I have a bit of a disagreement with Lucia, because unemployment in this recession is about 7.5 to 8%. That's the sort of ballpark estimate of it. If you imagined a comparable loss in or unemployment level impact of previous recessions, if we were to extrapolate from the loss of GDP, we could have expected 15% unemployment to up to 20% unemployment with this recession. It didn't happen. Now, it didn't happen for a variety of reasons, one of which, but it's not to do with the level of underemployment, because the extent of underemployment expressed in involuntary part-time employment is too small for that. Before the crisis, it's 12%. After the crisis, 18%. It's not enough expansion of involuntary part-time employment to explain it. In terms of age, there's an important point about age in all this, because the effect of the crisis is different along the age spectrum. One of the things that's happening very, very significantly is that the age of exit from the labour market, the age of exit from employment, has jumped radically since 2000, massively expanding with the rising, being elevated by the changes to pensions and retirement age. Huge increases. The downstream consequences of that, one of which is youth unemployment. There's also other impacts upon young people. But it's a longer-term trend amongst the youth labour market, going back 3 recessions, back to the 1970s, in which we have progressively seen the rise in youth unemployment. Spectacular in a ghastly way in terms of countries like Spain and so forth, and Southern Europe. But it's also pretty bad with 20% in this country. Also significantly, it's not just unemployment for young people, it's also graduate unemployment, and also very significantly, and we don't talk about it much, the overqualification of graduates. One of the recent figures from the ONS, National Statistics Office, says that of university graduates who have come out in the last 6 years, 38% of them are in jobs that do not require a university degree. That's almost 40% of people leaving university are in work in areas that doesn't demand graduate level qualifications, which suggests a very significant deterioration in the employment prospects of young people, which is part of an ongoing trend. So we have, if you like, two kind of audiences for discussion about precarity. And I think in terms of why we're talking about it, obviously it's not because of American post-Marxists, but the reason why we're talking about it is the expression of the crisis, and we have to put the way in which it's manifest, the way it evolves, and the way it mutates is hugely important. And one of the things that evolves at the same time is this idea of precarity, because it's a term that is evolving and changing. When it first arrived, when it first entered public discourse in France, it did not relate to employment. It was a reference to poverty, housing, and kind of life chances. Only latterly did it become, did it refer to work, employment security, job insecurity. Later on, Bourdieu talked about it being a mode of social control. Now, I'd imagine, it's also possible to see its further evolution. I think people are less and less convinced of the idea of a separate class, but the idea of precariousness, more and more concerned not just with those in marginal positions in irregular employment, but a much broader understanding of those who are the objects and the subjects of work intensification, in which the working environment engenders employment security. That is why it's a notion that must evolve across the class to generalise, to capture the experience of the vast majority of the workforce. Thanks.
Okay, I think that in order to talk about precarity, we need to look both at the kind of employment relations, but also at the structural characteristics of the capitalist mode of production, and also at the kind of structural transformations induced by neoliberalism and the crisis. And I think that we need to analyze the long-term effect of the industrialization process that has taken place in the UK and in Western Europe and is still taking place. And for example, if we look at employment dynamics in the UK, between 1979 and 2009, it was the public sector that generated employment. It was a major factor that somehow compensated the growth of unemployment. But the crisis has put an end to this kind of trajectory in which public sector can compensate job losses in the industrial sector. And so I think that people feel that there is a kind of structural situation of precarity which is related to structural transformations in the economy, and we need to take those kind of things into account, so the kind of long-term effect of the crisis. And we also need to consider that labor markets are not a kind of box, like closed and divided from the rest of the world, but we need to take structurally into account migration processes. If we look, for example, at the UK, in the same period, so in the neoliberal period, the labor supply rose from 35 million to 40 million people. So it rose by 5 million people, and this was related to workfare policies, pensions reforms, and immigration. And I think this is important because if we talk about working class solidarity, it's true that we need to develop a kind of unitary strategy, but today I have heard much more about that than also kind of realistic consideration of the factors that divide the working class, which I think it's important to take into account, like, for example, migration status, legal status, employment status, these kind of things. And I don't say that because I think there are different classes, like the guy standing says, but because I think this is kind of, this is very important in order to develop a unitary strategy that takes these differences into account. Just, I mean, I want to just conclude with an example from Italy, because coming from Italy, this kind of debate about precarity seems like, oh my God, this is something we discussed 10 years ago, what's wrong? I mean, and basically what happened happened in Italy is that people like the centri sociali and the people, the comrade quoted, San Precario and so on, they kind of substantialized and divided a kind of new generation of precarious workers from the rest of the working class. And when there was the possibility to fight together, they said, sorry, we don't want to fight with the unions because the unions are corrupted. And so the workers who are organized with the unions, sorry, I don't know, I don't want to go on the street with you. And so basically this was a strategy that supported the left-wing government in Italy, the Prodi government in 2005. And so on the one side, these people wanted to organize the precarious workers, and in the end this was a kind of catastrophe, a kind of bankrupt strategy. On the other side, however, even the main unions didn't do anything to organize precarious workers in a kind of effective way. And the situation now is that there isn't a debate on precarity in Italy because everybody is precarious in Italy. There are plant closures. I mean, there is a kind of unemployment situation which is dramatic, especially for young people, as the comrade said. And yeah, it's also true that we also need to take the black economy, informal sectors into account if we want to do a kind of serious reflection about that. And on the other side, the main unions, so we have a kind of situation in which everybody is precarious, so this debate doesn't kind of apply anymore. But these kind of separation, divisions among workers has weakened considerably the working class. And so we have situations in which we have subcontracting layers of employment in which the unions have done nothing to organize kind of undocumented illegal workers who work like in factories everywhere, agriculture everywhere. And now, basically, they are completely divided and are not able to face the fact that these plants also kind of for more kind of stable and protected workers, they are also shutting down the factories. So they are also precarious. But basically, they are divided and they are not able to organize all workers against that. And so that's why I think it's important both to look at the kind of unitary situation of exploitation, precarity, and so on, but also to understand the kind of different forms in which this kind of situation expresses itself. And I think this is something that is essential to develop a unitary strategy of resistance.